Good evening. I'm Renee Shaw. We're live from our KET Capitol Bureau for Kentucky Tonight as we discuss the state budget with our guests. Representative Stephen Rudy, Republican from Paducah and chair of the House Appropriations and Revenue Committee. Representative Angie Hatton, a Democrat from Whitesburg and the House Minority Whip. Representative James Tipton, Republican from Taylorsville and a member of the House Appropriations and Revenue Committee, and Representative Joe Gravis, a Democrat from Versailles and a member of the Public Pension Oversight Board. We want you to join the conversation tonight on Twitter at KYTonight, KET. Send an email to kytonight@ket.org. Use the web form at ket.org/kytonight. Make sure to check the box. It says you're not a robot. Or you may give us a call at 1-800-494-7605. Please include your first and last name and town or county on all messages. Well, welcome to you all. Thank you for making time. I'm glad we could come here to be with you all tonight. Save you a little bit of the commute. So appreciate it so very much. We are at day 33, Chairman Rudy, and I know that we're probably going to see a budget version from the House, from the GOP caucus emerge really soon. Can you tell us the timeline on which you will have a markup that will be available for the public on the budget?
I fully expect within the next 2 weeks to have the document finalized and the recommendations to be brought for the full House consideration, hopefully by the end of next week. 2 years ago, it was our first effort in the majority of doing the budget, and we tried to get it done in a timely fashion. I believe the day we voted it out on the House floor 2 years ago was March 1st. With the administration change, step one in the process is the governor's recommendation. They actually got an extra week of time, so that has kind of delayed us a little bit, but we're still trying to get it out hopefully by the end of the first full week of March.
Which is pretty standard on the time. So, as you know, the governor made his recommendation that it was an education-first budget. He deemed that his top commitments were public education, health care, children and families, jobs and public employees, and pensions. So I'm curious to know what is different or similar between what he has said are priorities and what the GOP caucus in the House says are priorities.
I think we're looking at a lot of his recommendations, certainly taking a deep dive into those as we've gone through the process. The subcommittee chairs in each different area have studied the recommendations and had public hearings on those. Budget Director Hicks came before full ANR a couple of weeks ago and kind of gave us more details of that recommendation. We're looking at a lot of his recommendations and taking them seriously and going through them all with a fine-tooth comb. I think one of the areas we have to look at first off is the revenue enhancements that the governor proposed with that as well. I've gotten several calls because my name is the sponsor of those bills, people concerned with them, but I want them to know it's just a step in the process. Typically,
the A&R chair carries that bill.
The A&R chair will usually file those bills on behalf of the governor as part of the job, and we fully expect to look at a lot of things. I mean, some of our members and a lot of the people that are involved in shaping this document, from stakeholders to majority and minority members, the taxpayers, there's a lot of concern about some of his recommendations. I know one of the areas that has gotten a few calls, not a lot of press about it, but we've gotten several calls about his increase to the LLETs and what that's going to do to small businesses across the state. So that predicated about $8 million of his recommendations. So if we chose not to go down that path, that starts.
And these are the limited liability
limited liability
yeah.
small businesses across the state that pay a minimum. He raised that minimum significantly. I mean, it's
to what, $240,
I believe, from 120, whatever it was. There's been a lot of concern about that. The funds transfers, there's certainly a lot of concerns about that are actually in the budget document itself. You start out with those, the willingness of the General Assembly to do another round of cigarette tax. I don't know where we are on that. I'm certainly getting a lot of calls from the members and the stakeholders that deal with that. Some of them would say, why don't you go more? Why don't you, you've already taxed this 2 years ago significantly. How many times are you going to go back to that well? So those discussions are going on, but I think it's fair to say if you look at the revenue enhancements and say we didn't go down all those paths, that makes the hole a little bit deeper because the budget must be balanced. And when we're already starting out in a hole as it begins with what the judicial and legislative branches are concerned about what he's done on their placeholders and the recommendations. So, we will probably look at the revenue side first to decide how much money that the taxpayers will be sending up here, and we'll base the budget accordingly, certainly looking at all the governor's recommendations and taking those under advisement.
So to this side of the table, Representative Gravis.
Representative Rudy is correct. And that LLC tax that raised in the governor's budget from $175 a year to $225 a year, it's a $50 a year increase. I used to have 10 or 15 of those at any given time. And that's an insignificant increase to the vast majority of those 165,000 LLCs across Kentucky. But that's the only revenue measure that was in Governor Beshear's proposal that wasn't from the Republican side. 3 of the 4 revenue measures were ideas proposed by our colleagues across the aisle. And so I think he did a good job of trying to bring in both sides and do an education first budget.
And even the fund transfers, was that an idea that was on?
No, I'm talking about the gaming and some of the other revenue options. The fund transfers were the least in memory. I don't know. Have you ever seen less fund transfers in your day?
Well, some of those accounts, we didn't really tap into the big fund transfers like that.
And why is that giving you such heartburn?
Well,
the fund transfers?
Typically those restricted funds are raised by those different areas, and they will more often than not fund the areas that they send that there. Fish and Wildlife, for example, that the money that Fish and Wildlife generates typically goes to Fish and Wildlife resources, and this was a general fund transfer on that specific area. We have done fund transfers in the form of the health insurance thing that the state insurance fund, which is a self-insured fund, and we have done larger dollar amounts of that.
Wasn't that $500 million at one time?
And that was, as we looked at that and had that discussion, the governor didn't recommend that. I don't think we're going to go down that path again. But as we've looked at that historically, that has been funds, since 2005, the state's been self-insured, and that account has kind of been like, we looked at that as like the profits of the self-insurance, and we reinvested those into the state budget in previous budgets. So, you can say dollar for dollar, there's not as many transfers, but as these individual ones, there's certainly been a lot of concerns on the different areas.
It's great you brought up the Fish and Wildlife. That's very, there's like 500,000 sportsmen across Kentucky. And so this is a really big deal. And the $5.5 million a year from the motorboat fees, I was speaking to Director Hicks, who's done an unbelievable job of trying to balance this budget and be fair and have no new cuts. Interestingly, the Fish and Wildlife folks, they benefited from an unbudgeted indirect cost recovery of about $12 million. And so they're actually going to come out ahead when you take those motorboat fees for 2 years. And those fees are not subject to the federal transfer rules. So, yeah, they had to do some sweeping. And I think if we could grow our economy more and have more revenue, we wouldn't have to have so many fund transfers. But at least this one is offset by this unbudgeted indirect cost recovery that they found.
And to this side, are you committed to making sure that there are no cuts as the governor had proposed? After 14 years or so of cuts, this would be the first time since 2006. Are you in line with that kind of thinking?
I think we want to make the budget as painless as possible for the shareholders, for those affected, and that would be an admirable goal. That if we could leave everybody where they were, man, that would be certainly a win. But I think we also lose sight sometimes of the taxpayers' perspective of this. There are currently 4.3 million Kentuckians sending in the second year of the biennium nearly $12 billion to the Capitol here to fund state government. And it's not enough. It's never going to be enough. But it's all-time high. if the forecasted nearly $12 billion that the taxpayers are sending up here, and there's not just an outcry for people jumping up and down to send more, as we've had that conversation many times.
We've talked about that before. So a continuation budget may not be in the future, that there could be some cuts to certain agencies.
Well, we're going to try to look at all the areas, prioritize certainly. Every document, the House version will certainly look different than the Senate version, but the finished product, hopefully by April 15th, we'll know more about what that finished product is at the end of the session.
And Representative Tipton, you were one of those budget review subcommittee chairmen, so talk to us about your perspective on the governor's budget, and particularly the committee that
Sure, I serve as the budget review subcommittee chairman for post-secondary education. Obviously, our universities have taken a lot of cuts since 2008. We are seeing increased tuition rates over the last 10, 12 years. In the governor's proposed budget, there was a proposal to increase the base funding for all our universities by 1%. That is goes against what was the ultimate. 2 years ago, there was more of an emphasis on funding the performance-based funding model. However, Governor Brashear did not put any funds in for that.
So that's essentially suspended underneath his proposal.
Under Governor Brashear's proposal, the couple of other areas that the universities are very concerned about. In that performance-based funding model, we currently have a 2% stop loss measure where funds would not transfer more than 2%. They have asked us to consider keeping that 2% in temporarily. In Senate Bill 153 that passed in 2017, there was a provision that the working group on the performance-based funding model would come back this year and review how the model has worked. So we look forward to that. So that is one of their concerns. Another concern is they have the governor referred to it as a resurgence fund, but it's deferred maintenance on these campuses. We're talking about roofs, sewer systems, those types of things. So the CPE had actually requested $400 million in bonding authority. The governor placed $200 million in, with the local universities having to make a 50% match on that. So that's something we're looking at very closely. But probably one area that impacts your universities more than anything else is the potential for their increased pension obligation. And that is something that we are working at very, very, very closely. Representative Gravis and I were part of a group that worked all summer long, coming up with House Bill 171, which just passed out of the House, which will change the allocation from a percent of payroll to you're basically paying on your actual unfunded liability.
Level dollar funding.
Level dollar funding, you're paying on your actual liability.
It's like a mortgage over 27 years.
Yeah, it will be over 27 years. In order for that to effectively work, it's going to be contingent on us putting together a budget bill that will backstop some of those dollars, because some of these institutions, and it's not just universities, some of the quasi-governmental agencies, actually they're going to be looking pretty good. There are others that are going to be completely opposite. So our goal is how do we keep these quasi-agencies? I'm talking about health departments, regional mental health centers, our universities or schools. How do we keep them afloat without having to bear just a terrific increase in their pension obligations over the next 2 years?
Well, Renee, I think that the governor's budget has done a good job of taking care of the quasi-governmental agencies. He instituted a freeze in the employer's contribution rate for, I believe it is 67.4% or something like that, which saves them from the very dangerous 93% contribution rate that they were looking at. And if not for what the governor is doing in this budget, which is, I believe, $16.5 million each year for the health departments and $13.1 million each year for the community mental health centers, then a lot of these institutions that we depend on in small communities would be bankrupt. And back to the higher education, I know I don't have to tell Representative Tipton because this is definitely your area, but this is the first time we haven't made cuts to the universities since 2008. And that performance-based funding model, while very well-intentioned, is putting some smaller universities like Morehead State University and Eastern Kentucky University and our community colleges in some pretty hard times if we don't keep that 2% stopgap.
Renee, if I could add just one point on Representative Hatton's comments. The governor did put the floor of the 67% for the quasi-sites. A few weeks ago, I had KRS Director Dave Eager in front of my committee, and I asked him that question because as a result of that, that means the Kentucky retirement system, the KERS non-hazardous, will not receive as much funds as they have requested that they say they need. And the
Tens
number,
of millions, right?
$83 million was the number that he gave. So that's an area, obviously it's relief to the quasi-sites, but at the same time we're concerned about making sure our retirement system is the worst funded retirement system in the country at 13%, gets the money that they need to stay actuarially sound.
Representative Gravis, which proposal do you prefer, the governor's or House Bill 171?
Well, I think we need a blend of both, and I think Representative Rudy nailed it the other day when he was speaking on the floor when we got the unanimous vote to pass 171 through the House. And he talked about a three-phase approach, and he was spot on. And phase one is House Bill 171, and then phase two is House Bill 129. We can get into that later if you want to. And then phase three is going to be the budget work and making sure that the backstop that Representative Rudy is talking about is there, and it actually needs to be a little more than what the governor has proposed. But that $83 million has been mitigated. When you look at the ARC at 93%, and then the governor's budget at 67%, where the quasis would meet halfway,
right.
He put in another $50 million on top of that to take it to 84%, and then about the $26 million balance. The budget director has discussed that would be made up over the biennium with the 1% pay increase to state employees, and then the hiring of 350 social workers that I sure hope we can hire real quick,
and so
in addition to some revenue audit staff.
Explain to our listeners and viewers why a 1% increase for state workers, or there's a different proposal that Representative Tipton has, which would be based on the consumer price index of 2.25, the COLA, 2.25%. Why is that good for the pension system? Because some people may think that's counterintuitive.
Well, payroll growth is the biggest driver to our assumptions, and getting good assumptions, proper assumptions, adding value to the pension system. As your pay rate goes up, so does your contribution to the pension system.
And that's one of the reasons that our pension system is so underfunded, is because we had counted on there being raises for public employees, and there weren't.
Yeah, and haven't been for quite some time.
And not only have there not been, I'm sorry, Representative, not only has there not been raises, people have been shedding payroll, and that's one of the silver linings, most beautiful aspects of 171, is it takes away that incentive for people to shed payroll, and it incentivizes folks to bring folks back on, because they can bring those folks that they have contracted out back cheaper at just the normal costs than having to pay the extra costs to the contractor.
And in your bill, I can't remember the number.
House Bill 143.
143. So, and there's another bill that you had about the legislative pensions, which I want us to talk about. But let's talk about 143. That would pretty much suspend the statutory 5% that has not been activated.
Currently, it's been 2001,
right?
I believe, since state employees received that 5% salary increment. Since then, it has been not withstood. There have been some years that they have received some salary increase. I believe it's been 5 or 6 years, maybe they got a 1% increase then. House Bill 143 would change that 5% salary increment. We would base it on the average of the previous 2 annual CPIs. And based our fiscal note said that based on the last 2 annual years, that would be like 2.25%. Actually, the state, I had a group of state employees come to me and ask me to file this bill because they understand that going forward, the 5% number is not sustainable.
Sure.
So, but we were trying to get a number that would be more realistic, more applicable going forward. But
that's only for this biennial budget, though. That doesn't mean that would be.
Well, it would change state statute. Even if we passed the bill, it still does not mean that statute could get not withstood.
Right.
Because we have to have the dollars. And I was getting ready to make the point that in the governor's proposed budget, his proposal was a 1% salary increase for the state employees and also the legislative and judicial branch employees. So the question is, we have to have the funds, but I think we have to want to shine some light on this issue. Let our valuable state employees know that we're concerned about them, because we have to have quality, dedicated staff. And I'm hopeful as we go through the budget process that it would be my hope that we can keep that 1% in for our state employees this time.
So the 143, would it not also apply to teachers, judicial, and legislative branch employees, but not elected officials?
There is another state statute that says that teachers will get the same pay increase as state employees does. What the governor did in his proposal is, since he had other language in there about teachers, he notwithstood that statute. So that particular statute. So it's possible that you do one without the other, but notwithstanding that second statute. But I'm hopeful there'll be money there for everybody. So we've got to find out. We've got to know how much. As the chairman said, we've got to have the revenue source to be able to do that.
Yeah. You are watching Kentucky Tonight. We're over here in our KET Capitol Annex operations, and we thank you for joining us tonight and the privilege of having an hour of your time this evening talking about the state budget, pensions, all that's around all of that. And I want to go back to you, Representative Tipton, because I mentioned that you have another bill, is it 270, that addresses legislative pensions. And so tell us about this.
Sure. House Bill 270, it does, as it's currently written, would do 3 or 4 things. One thing, all new employees would go into the KERS non-hazardous plan. All new legislators
hired after July 1st.
Going forward. Also, any legislator who came into the system after January 1st, 2014, as a result of Senate Bill 2 in 2013, anybody in the L system would also move into KERS non-hazardous. I had a lot of people say, why do the legislators have a separate system? Over time, we would all legislators over time would wind up in the Kentucky Employee Retirement System, just like our state employees. There is also a provision in that bill that on a go-forward basis, we would not fund the legislative retirement system until such point in time as the funding level for KERS non-hazardous is equal or less than that funding level. In the 2018 budget, we made the decision to take the dollars that were going to the legislative system and to put into the state police retirement fund to help shore up. There's a couple of other provisions in there. One of them in particular goes back to a law that was passed in 2005, House Bill 299.
The Greed Bill? The
Greed Bill, as it's often called, that would allow a legislator who has served in the legislature to leave, go to another area of state government. They could count their high 3, and there have been several legislators who have spiked their pensions on that dramatically. The bill that passed out of state government committee would remove that provision. It would also change a provision that the benefit factor right now, state employees, the KERS non-hazardous are based on a 1.97% benefit factor. Legislative is based on a 2.75% benefit factor. And before my good friend, Representative Gravis, brings up his point.
You knew it was coming.
I knew it was coming. I have asked for a committee substitute on my bill that will take out the provision on the reciprocity and the benefit factor.
Because do you think I think Representative Gravis might have violated the inviolable contract?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That is my opinion and a lot of lawyers' opinions that I've talked with. We do not want to get near the inviolable contract foundation and put a crack in there that could spread to other pension plans. And Representative Tipton and I have worked extremely well on a whole lot of things over the summer and during the session, and I really admire and appreciate all that he's done and the willingness to work together. And we've crafted some legislation that has come out very different than what we thought it was going to be when we came in because of being able to work in a bipartisan way. But we can't always agree on everything, and when we disagreed, like on this one, it was civil, and we disagreed, we agreed to disagree, and he let me know what he wanted to do, and I let him know that we have to protect that inviolable, and I filed the exact same bill, but without the inviolable contract issues in there, and so I'm really glad to hear this about the committee sub.
Yeah, because it's gone back to A&R.
It is back in AR
Yeah,
right now.
from state government, so it's been recommitted, and I think that'll maybe come up soon, Mr. Chairman.
We're focused on the budget right now. And we will, after we clear our plate for that, then we will look at all the other bills that have been assigned to the committee.
Okay, very good. Representative Haddon.
Well, I think Representative Rudy has taken on an awful lot this session. He's already A&R chair, and it's a budget year, and now he's acting as floor leader while our colleague Bam Carney is recovering from his illness. So we have to cut Representative Rudy just a little bit of slack, but all eyes are on him. We're ready to see what he thinks about what we think is an awfully good budget that Governor Beshear has put forth.
Well, we've got a couple of email questions. I want to get to those, so these are kind of non sequiturs from what we've been talking about. But this one from Steve Thacker from Pike County says, and I'll just quote about black lung benefits, Representative Hatton, my dad and several family members have sacrificed their health and wellness as lifelong coal miners. My father suffered 3 fractures in his back and a surgically repaired leg and stayed on a ventilator for weeks when I was 17 in 1986. Coal mining monies built infrastructure and helped modernize Kentucky. How do you explain today's cuts to black lung benefits for miners?
Mr. Thacker, thank you so much for your question, and I promise you I share your concerns. My husband worked 27 years underground. I'm a coal miner's daughter, coal miner's granddaughter, coal miner's great-granddaughter, niece, etc. And my House Bill 239 aims to correct what I believe was a terrible mistake in House Bill 2 in 2018, which changed the B-reader requirements and allowed only pulmonologists and no longer radiologists to serve as B-readers, so that their testimony is given presumptive weight in black lung hearings. I think it is definitely resulting in smaller claims and claims taking longer, and it removed all of the doctors from the coal field. So now miners have to come from eastern and western Kentucky up to central Kentucky to get treatment, and I don't know of any reason for it. I believe it was arbitrary, and I'll never fully understand why it was done.
You have another bill that I think you've worked with Senator Turner on.
Yes.
That's about the whole bond issue with coal companies. And that was scheduled for a hearing at one time and then disappeared from the agenda. Just curious about where that bill stands. Many are also curious about the Black Jewel situation and going forward how coal companies will be held responsible when they go bankrupt and need to pay the coal miners.
Well, as for Senator Turner's bill, I believe it's just getting tweaked. I believe we'll see it again, and I think everyone on both sides of the aisle understands how necessary that is, because I went down and visited those miners on the tracks, and they were guarding the coal that they had mined and facing down the train until they were paid for it. It was really a moving scene, and they had their little children out there. It was really hard to see, and in that case their paychecks had bounced and were clawed back out of their accounts, and they were all in the red, and it was vacation time, and some of them were out of town when it happened. So those performance bonds are very important, and I know the governor is working very closely with Senator Turner and myself, and his Energy and Environment Cabinet is looking at those performance bonds to make sure that everyone
and not
is
just for
paying
those
them.
companies that have had a history of 5 years, or would it take away that? Would it be all companies?
Well, we have to see what it looks like when it comes back out, but I know that existing companies are not protecting their workers as they should, and coal companies change hands very frequently, and they're very hard to keep track of.
Let me jump to this phone question from Marie Adkins from Boyle County about inconsistent retirement benefits. Why did they, she asked, cut a portion of people off from retirement benefits but not everyone? And those who do have retirement benefits, why haven't we gotten another raise? I'm looking at the two pension heads here. I'm not quite sure I completely understand the question, but maybe perhaps you all have a good interpretation.
I'm really not for sure exactly what the question is about the people who were cut off. As far as I think they're referring to a cost of living adjustment, the second part of cost of living adjustment for our Kentucky retirees, and simply the last few years since 2008, there has simply not been enough money to fund all the we have to fund the pension cost. We started in 2014 with the K system. In 2016, we got within 93%, I think, of the teacher retirement system, and in 2018, we fully funded those systems. So we went from about $1 billion to 3.4 billion over 2 budget cycles, and that has just taken so much money out of every other potential service that it's made it very difficult to provide funding to other needed areas.
Right. And the commitment to fully fund the actuarially required contribution is still there. You're still looking at $1 billion plus.
It's still very much a priority, and I mean, for every dollar of payroll, there's another 93 cents that have to go to pension obligations, and that is just pensions. We can go back to the old days of underfunding them, and we'll have enough money to do a lot of things, but that is not fiscally responsible. We have to pay the debts that have been put before the Commonwealth, and that's priority number one.
And
Representative, go ahead.
I just think that both sides have learned a lesson from underfunding pensions in the past. I think both parties are to blame, and that we have certainly learned our lesson, and I think both parties are committed to fully fund the ARC.
Yeah, Representative Hatton and Representative Rudy are exactly right, and as long as we pay the full ARC, the light at the end of the tunnel is very visible, and it gets brighter every year we pay that ARC. And in 24 to 27 years, we're out of the woods.
With or without structural changes to the teachers' retirement system?
According to GRS, the actuaries, and you look at their charts, and I've got them in here if you want to see them, you pay the ARC, the unfunded liability goes away in 24 to 27 years, and we're back to normal cost.
Without cutting benefits or violating the inviolable
But
cost.
I think the important part of that, though, is the ARC continues to go up and eat up more and more and more of the state's budget. And we're already at 93 cents for every dollar, and the trajectory is still going up. So I think that we still have to consider structural changes, because it is a long way to get to that light at the end of the
And
tunnel.
will we see a bill with structural changes this session when
House
it comes
Bill
to teachers?
171 was a big-time structural change.
If it passes the Senate.
Yeah, we really need to get it through the Senate. I mean, Representative Rudy is correct, but we had heard testimony today in the Public Pension Oversight Board meeting from the people that run the pension systems, and in 3 to 5 years, the asset base grows to such a level that they feel very comfortable at reviewing the assumptions. And if we can get the assumptions more appropriate, then the ARC will go down. And even according to GRS, if you look at their projections, without doing anything, as the asset base grows, the ARC begins to come down. It goes up a little bit, and then it starts coming down.
At what time does it come down? How many years?
I think it starts coming down in like 10 or 15 years.
And there's a lot of assumptions in that, too. We've been 11 years, 12 years without a recession. I mean, we've been on a steady, and that is beyond any of our controls.
Stock
and
market
those
was
cycles,
down 1,000 today.
Well, and that's the question that
roller
people ask,
coaster,
right? Is what happens if there's a downturn in the economy?
And the downturn in the economy, I think that we have to look at a lot of those assumptions, and assumptions are just assumptions, and I think that we have to factor in the taxpayers as we make these decisions going forward.
I will point out, back in 2018, there was a lot of discussion. Senate Bill 1 came out. I remember looking at actuarial analysis, Senate Bill 1, Senate Committee Substitute 1. Of course, that bill did not proceed. But in reading that actuarial analysis, they gave a comparison of the current law, how much the cost would be, and what the changes would be on Senate Bill 1. But the thing that caught my eye from that figure was we were currently paying $1.1 billion, and if we make no changes to TRS by 2038, that number goes to $2 billion per year. So we have this increasing expense, and the question is, can our increase in revenue?
We need to look at their payroll growth too in TRS.
So is there a bill being worked on that addresses structural changes in the teachers' retirement system? Can we expect that? You've got another week before the bills have to be filed by the House?
I think the last day to file is March
2nd, next Monday. Yeah.
So there are discussions going on.
Is that involving the KEA and these other stakeholders who have been pretty
any
adamant in their
discussion
opposition?
that would go on would involve every stakeholder.
Okay.
And Renee, I
We
hate
hope.
to totally shift subjects, but we have got to do some meaningful criminal justice reform. That's the other
Big
part
time.
that is eating up
Sure.
our budget to cage Kentuckians.
Yep.
And it is an area where we absolutely have to make changes. What we're doing isn't working. We can't incarcerate away addiction. And I didn't mean to completely switch
No, that's
subjects,
okay.
but that is
Good point.
definitely an
Right.
area where we have some room to save significant amounts of our budget and free up money for things we actually want to spend money on.
Well, we know there's some efforts on bail reform. When you mention criminal justice reform, that's a pretty large juggernaut there to get your hands around. So would you be satisfied if there was some incremental reform, such as pretrial or bail reform, or both?
As long as it's well thought out, well reasoned, all parties concerned, and based on evidence, I'm okay with it being incremental. It doesn't have to happen all in 1 year, but we do have to have the courage to do it. We do have to absolutely make sure that both sides are committed, and I believe Representative Petrie is committed, and
He's Judiciary Chairman in the House.
yes, and that we can do that. We just have to have the courage to do it.
Yeah. Another question, I think this person conflated a couple of things here, so I'm going to reinterpret the question. Shirley Anderson from Trimble County, how much of the budget will you give to Brady Industries, the aluminum company? So, and they've testified before the Senate A&R committee the last couple of weeks, and they've said that they're going to make good on their promise, and that the $15 million that Kentucky invested, there will be a return on investment. Are you convinced when you hear the new CEO say that?
Well, I'm hopeful. I know Representative Bentley is one of Brady's biggest cheerleaders. It's right in his
And so is
backyard.
Robin Webb in the Senate.
Robin Webb and
Yeah.
all of them, and they have not asked for additional monies that I'm aware of. No budget request as far as giving more money. I hope that we get return on investment on the $15 million from previous sessions, but I don't think we
It would
will
be great if that
dedicate
could-
any more to this.
Right.
What a great thing for Kentucky if that can actually happen. But until then, I would hope they would put our $15 million in an escrow. They've got like $65 million or something in cash that they're just sitting on. I'd like to see them put our 15 into an escrow account that doesn't get used until they meet their requirements, and then they can tap it. And if they go away or they file bankruptcy or something, that 15's in escrow, safe. Kentucky can get it back.
Yeah. Can that be legislatively mandated that they do that, since it was a taxpayer-funded venture to begin with? Can you put those conditions?
I'm not at liberty to say. I think that probably we could pass. I mean, we're the General Assembly. We could pass a law that says about anything, but I don't know if it would withstand court challenge.
Well,
but we
House
will-
Bill 413, Representative Tipton, is this not your bill that Americans for Prosperity and also the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, two pretty
What do you
divergent,
think about that?
who are in favor of
It's
this
in
bill.
times. It's in
I tell you,
times.
it's in times. But this was said last week on
Yeah.
the show that they both call this a good government bill. This would create a framework for lawmakers to know more about and understand the cost and the impact of these tax expenditures. What we're talking about with Brady, 5-year sunset for all new tax expenditures, creation of a 17-member tax expenditure oversight board. I mean, this is a step in the right direction. And
Big
does
time.
it work retroactively, though, where you can go back to a Brady or a Kentucky Wired and say, hey, now you've got to do this stuff to show that, you're being good stewards of the taxpayer dollars?
House Bill 413, I want to thank Representative Graves. This is another piece of legislation.
It's
I filed
good work.
I filed House Bill 292 last session. We followed up and we've worked together on this. There are currently about $8 billion per year in tax expenditures. These are things like tax credits. These are exemptions. When you purchase food, you do not pay. You have exempted from paying sales tax, prescription medicine. So it's a whole combination of different things. And
Yeah, we typically think of corporations, but expenditures are all these
many
things.
part of it impacts individuals as well. What House Bill 413 would do, it would set up an oversight board, a tax expenditure oversight board to review these tax expenditures, because many of them have been on the books for many years without much follow-up, and it would give us an opportunity to go in, take a hard look at them, ask tough questions, because truthfully I don't think the General Assembly knows enough about these tax expenditures and what's involved in them, and then the tax expenditure oversight board could make recommendations to the General Assembly
Right.
going
So the
forward.
question is, what's the accountability that you could have, right? Or
Is it
sanctions,
is it-
or what would that
Is
be?
it something that's still worthwhile to the Commonwealth?
Yeah.
If it is, it's something we may need to keep. If it's not, we may need to take a look at eliminating that particular tax expenditure.
If it's bringing us more revenue than we're letting them have, we obviously want to keep it, but the oversight board would be the ones that would look at that. It's a good bill, and when you have both sides working on a bill and agreeing on it, and then you have AFP and KSEP agreeing at the same time with bipartisan legislation, that says that must be a good piece of legislation.
And Renee, I'm a big fan of quality bills over quantity of bills, and I've got to give the majority party credit. They removed the consent calendar, and I thought that was a strange decision.
Yeah.
But I need to look at the number of bills we passed compared to the number of bills we passed, midterm 2 years ago when it was another 60-day session. But I mean, the quality of bills that come out has to be improved when we take our time and we talk about them more and we don't rush them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree with that. Although we're kind of curious about why get rid of the consent calendar, which for those who don't know, it's one way to kind of pass a bunch of bills that are significant but not so
Sure.
consequential, and
So
you can get them through.
I encourage leadership to go down that path, because it was amazing as I'm trying to craft a $12 billion
Sure.
a year spending plan. Sometimes bills come through on consent calendar that maybe should have stopped over the Appropriations and Revenue Committee, that may actually cost the taxpayers some money. And sometimes quality is better than quantity, and we have to look at all those things, and especially when budget times are tough, we've tried to slow down the process and give everything due diligence and quit passing things. So a lot of them are admirable and a lot of good ideas, but I mean, at the end of the day, if they cost the taxpayers money, we can do that, but we're either going to have to raise taxes somewhere or take it from somewhere else, because the budget has to be balanced.
Right.
Just plant another money tree.
Yeah, but there is a structural imbalance, though, right, with every budget. How much is that, and is that significant?
It's always significant. There's always one-time monies paid for recurring costs, and we try to get that down as low as possible. It's amazing how every year, and there's always one-time monies every single year. So, I mean, part of that's always going to be there, and we just try to limit that because bond rating agencies look at things like structural imbalance, and we have to pay the cost.
Yeah. So this question about higher ed funding increase and just education in general, they'd be interested to know the panel's thought on the Pritchard Committee's proposal to increase pre-K through higher ed funding by $1 billion over the next 6 years. The big bold ask, as they call it.
I attended a dinner time meeting that the Pritchard Committee did, and if we could make that happen, I have no doubt in my mind that it would make Kentucky a much better place and our future brighter. It's a matter of finding all that money. We got to be bold, and criminal justice reform and a lot of other things, and maybe new revenue in order to make sure that we get enough money to do the kinds of things that we need. In the Pritchard Committee's idea, it is big and bold, but I mean, some of those were some great ideas, And
Well, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
When you figure we're spending $100 million more this year on extra prison beds, if we could whittle that away, that would go a long way to
That's
helping
right.
fund this
And
Big Bold Ass, which is a great program. We just got to have the money for
Well,
it.
even the governor didn't ask for early learning money. He even said that's one area that he couldn't do.
He
we
said it was a
did.
priority, and
I
he's
mean,
working
it's
in
$10
getting
million
there.
for disadvantaged areas, but it's not
It's a
the
start.
full scale.
And I just hope we leave the rest of what the governor put into this budget for education alone. Representative Rudy, we had a $2,000 raise for teachers. We had a 1% increase in SEEK, $22 million for textbooks, which wasn't in there at all the last time. And we're fully funding the pension, 150 new school buses, teacher loan forgiveness and scholarships, and then $18 million for school safety. It's about time we fund that. So, I mean, we'll all be watching to see what of that can remain, and I remain very hopeful.
So the $2,000 for teachers, but that money doesn't go through the SEEK formula,
That's
correct, as the governor had proposed. Why is that significant? Why does it matter where the $2,000 comes from?
We're looking at his proposal on the enhancement in salaries for classroom-only
Right.
teachers. And, there's a lot of school bus drivers, lunch ladies, administrators that are asking us, well, where's our raise? So we're hearing that also, a little silent pushback on that. So we're trying to look at it all, and it was a one time for only classroom teachers, gets $2,000 this year, but when they retire, the new ones that get hired don't get that $2,000. There's a lot of questions about how that's modeled. We're looking at it. We're going to look at the whole funding of education. Education remains and will remain a priority, I think, for everybody in the General Assembly. Public education is near and dear to them, and different levels of near and dearness certainly on that. But it remains a priority for our caucus, I know, to look
to
at,
have some educator pay raises, or even for classified.
I think there seems to be more an emphasis on spreading the raises across the board. So we will visit that. We will look at that. I think one area of the school safety, I think the governor recommended funding for the hard cost of last year's Senate Bill 1. I think the House majority is really more interested in the mental health side of that too. Now, we don't know that we can fully fund
$121 million is
exactly
what the Kentucky School Boards Association
$121
says.
billion of counselors, but we think we can start making a dent at that, and we think that will be a priority to looking at funding more of the school safety, especially the mental health side of it.
I want to get to Representative Tipton's bill about the 2.25 cost of living. That did not cover classified school employees, right? Or would not cover classified school employees?
That bill dealt with state employees.
Right, but as you mentioned,
in the Kentucky employee retirement system, those are the state employees. There is a state law that says historically that bill dealt with the state employees, not the legislative and judicial. Historically, when state employees have gotten a raise, the judicial and legislative branch employees have also gotten a raise. Right. That other state statute says, the KRS, and forgive me, I don't remember that number right now, but it says anytime a state employee gets a raise, that the teachers will also get the same amount of raise. Right. And it's my understanding that historically, when the teachers have gotten that raise as well, that those classified, those school bus drivers, those cafeteria workers have also gotten that raise. But my legislation deals with changing it from the 5% to the 2.2. It would be 2.25 in this instance. That number could change on a go-forward basis.
Right. And everybody would like to give the classified school employees a raise as well. We have a teacher shortage, and I think that's what was trying to be addressed with the raise for teachers right now.
So in 9 minutes, can we talk about cities and counties who want more control over their revenue? Because they say the pension costs are eating them up too, right? There is House Bill 470, Shelbyville Republican Rob Rothenberger, that would grant all cities and counties, regardless of their size, the ability to level a restaurant tax at up to 3%. So the question is, how does everybody feel about that? And one of the things I often hear is that stackable? So could the city level a 3% and then the county come along and level another 3% on top of that? Or do we know if this legislation has a cap where it would prohibit stackable levy of taxes?
I believe that bill was referred to A&R, and we haven't had a chance to do a deep dive into that. I believe it was filed Friday.
Right.
I think as we shift the conversation to local tax reform and revenue availabilities, the Kentucky Section 181 of our Constitution levies, it gives the General Assembly the direction of what local taxes can be levied.
Right.
We have the ability to allow locals to only do it a certain way. And, when we had tax reform 2 years ago, and I watched comment the other night, a couple of weeks ago, and some of the journalists on there said that we needed tax reform. We've had meaningful tax reform. The steps that we took in the 2018 General Assembly moved us way up the list on tax competitiveness, but it didn't have anything to do with the local taxation and the local tax policies. And I think as we look at further tax reform and changing our tax code, my goal is to move us more to a consumption base and away from production base. I know taxes are not popular no matter what tax they are, but when you ask the people, would you rather pay on what you spend or what you earn. They're going to pick the spending every time. But there is not the ability, the Kentucky Constitution does not allow for a local option sales tax. So as we begin and want to move us to a more consumption-based economy and taxation policy to what I think will grow our economy more potentially, we have to look at the structure. I know Representative Meredith has filed a bill that deals with a constitutional amendment.
Right.
It says it will strike that language out and give the General Assembly then the ability to create a framework to allow for local taxation. Now, this is not going to immediately say that locals can do a sales tax.
Sure.
It's going to require a phased-in step. The General Assembly, should the General Assembly pass this constitutional amendments and then the voters ratify it, then we could create a framework in the 2021 sessions and going forward to move us hopefully to a new economy.
And that's House Bill, I'm sorry.
That's House Bill 475,
right.
Yeah, Michael Meredith's bill.
It has bipartisan support. I think at the last count he had 53 or 54 co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle. The Kentucky League of Cities really likes this bill, and it would have to pass constitutional muster, but there's a three-step process that we'd go through, and then maybe 100 years of the Constitution might be able to get looked at.
You're right. So how do you all feel about the restaurant tax for cities of any size? Any thoughts on that?
The cities like it, and we have a
Do you
whole.
like it for the cities?
I think it's the larger cities are not allowed to do it currently,
Right.
and that's more of an urban issue. So that's not really that's not where I'm from, and I would leave that more to the urban folks.
Sure.
But we have shifted more and more and more burdens of the cost over to our counties, and we're overburdening them, especially in rural counties. And thank goodness we did. The governor's budget does allow for 100% of coal severance tax to be returned to coal counties after the debt service is taken care of, and that makes a big difference for some of our smaller counties. But as we continue to shift burdens to the counties, we need to give them the ability to set their own tax rates.
So that could be, you can only put 2 constitutional amendments on the
Four.
ballot. Four. So we've got several out there that are coming through, but perhaps this one might have a little bit more legs and
Traditionally,
movement.
the House will offer 2 and the
That's
Senate
right.
will offer 2.
Right. So it could be a big ballot this time, considering the number of constitutional amendments
And
that are
with the
moving
new
through.
threshold that the Supreme Court's put on us, it could be a very long ballot.
Well, and we won't talk about Marcy's law, but that's one example of Senator Whitney Westerfield's bill. That question is going to be humongous if that makes it to the ballot. So there'll be a lot of education that needs to go along, and even the question as it's currently written in Michael Meredith's bill, it's a couple of sections here, and it would take you a lot to understand and interpret what that means, and you'd have to have a really good primer in order to understand how to vote on that. So I'm sure, and it does require that there is an education campaign by the Secretary of State. So we'll keep our eyes on that, and we'll talk about that restaurant tax maybe when you're more ready to talk about it. 3 minutes and some change remaining. So tax reform. That's the big thing. We know that the Democrats have a bill. Lisa Wilner is the prime sponsor, but there's a host of other sponsors who are along on that bill with her. House Bill 416, I believe it is, that would pretty much undo what the Republican supermajority has done when it comes to tax reform. So this side thinking need to reverse the upside-down nature, as Representative Wilner had told us, of tax reform already done, and go back to a graduated income tax as opposed to the flat rate and make some other changes?
Well, I think that we know that consumption-based tax disproportionately affects the poor, and that when we want to look at an equitable tax, that a flat tax across everyone's, regardless of income, isn't equitable and isn't fair. And Representative Wilner's bill would raise, I think,
She said $1
billion, and it'd just be by affecting the top 20% of the wealthiest.
It also
Kentuckians.
raises the cigarette tax another 50 cents to be $1.60 per pack. So there's some other changes there.
Yeah, but I mean, she's done some very thoughtful work, and a lot of folks have been involved, and I hope her bill gets some serious consideration.
Will her bill get a hearing, Chairman Rudy?
I've not had a conversation with her, so I don't know who all was involved in the crafting, but they've not had a conversation with the A&R chair.
Okay. All right. As we wrap up tonight's show, so Representative Rudy, we're going to start where we started. For those who might have missed the first couple of minutes of the show, we're at day 33, and it's about time that things are moving. And you've said that you can expect to have a bill to the Senate in the next couple of weeks.
Yes.
A budget bill.
Yes.
But a revenue bill you think would come first. Is that what you said
Well,
earlier?
typically a revenue bill accompanies the budget. I mean, we cannot have revenue in an appropriations bill.
Right.
The courts have ruled on that. So there's always a revenue bill that will companion and go with it. As far as meaningful tax reform, big, huge shifts and changes, I don't think the bandwidth or the will is there to do that this time. But we will always have some technical changes in the tax code and other things. I know one of the vaping tax, which we didn't even get into tonight.
Yeah, Jerry Miller's
that
bill.
one's posted in the orders of the day. We could potentially vote on that. So that
This week, right?
This week. So that, some of the budget will be predicated on what's done with that area.
And this is a 25% excise tax on vaping.
So we're looking at that. It's past A&R, and we plan to probably build the House version of the budget on some of those revenues and things like that.
Sports betting, would that be part of it?
Sports betting has been on the orders of the day for quite some time.
Growing with amendments as we speak,
yes,
right?
there are several amendments. I don't, whether or not we get into the, I don't know that I've seen the fiscal note on that. I know the governor, even in the governor's proposal, he said he based some of the budget on that, but he did not include it in the revenue bill that he had.
20 million or so.
So the 20 million's interestingly on sports gaming, and you've talked that one a lot, but every state that's passed it but one has brought in about half of what they forecast.
Okay, so we're going to keep on top of the budget. Thank you all very much. We hope to have the senators come in, and then we hope to mix it up toward the end. This has been a good conversation. I always learn a lot from you guys, and I appreciate your time, and ladies. And thank you for watching from our Frankfort Capitol Annex studios. I'm Renee Shaw. We'll be off next week for special PBS programming, but I'll see you March 9th, and of course I'll see you every night for Legislative Update at 11 p.m. Eastern Time. Take good care. See you soon.